book, Creole Clay, is the result of Trisha's 25-year quest for the origins of Caribbean ceramic traditions. Her quest started when, as a tourist in St. Lucia, Trisha bought her a very humble-looking ceramic cooking pot. Because she admired the integrity, honesty, and beauty of this object, Trisha wanted to know who made this, how was it made, and what are its cultural antecedents and backgrounds. There were not a lot of available answers to these questions. Yes. With most of us, when our research does not produce immediate results, the research becomes less urgent and sometimes forgotten. Not so with Trisha. With extraordinary perception and perseverance, Trisha began to search for the answers to these questions. During the process, Trisha became an anthropologist, an archaeologist, and a detective. She searched throughout the Caribbean and eventually traveled to Africa. During her research, Trisha collaborated, shared, and expanded her knowledge with other artists and professional scholars. A wonderful benefit of her research was her becoming intimate friends with the potters of St. Lucia, whom she introduced at the NCECA conference in Texas. I have known Trisha since she entered into the graduate program at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Since then, in many conversations, I have always asked her, how is the book coming along? For 25 years, there always was a positive answer, such as she found a skilled editor, or she obtained another research grant, and she even was a Fulbright scholar twice. This book, this labor of love, supported by her intuition, patience, and a scholar's stubbornness, that's a private joke, I'm sure, has come to fruition with its publication. We congratulate her and celebrate this event. Without any further commentary, let us welcome Trisha to talk about Creole Clay, a global story. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all very, very much for coming, and thank you, Frank, for our wonderful, very, very long friendship since before graduate school, through graduate school, and beyond. As Frank wonderfully introduced, I'm here to talk about this. Yes, eventually, it is possible to get the darn thing finished. So it just came out in November, and I was delighted to be able to come and talk about this here today. The Caribbean is a fascinating place, and the title of this, Creole Clay, A Global Story, the word Creole itself is even difficult because it was originally coined as a way to refer to the children of European settlers who were born in the Caribbean, right, as opposed to being European-born. But it has come to signify the incredible complexity and diversity of Caribbean culture that is a result of its global origins. Arguably, in terms of surface area, the Caribbean is the most complicated demographic space in the world. And that is because of all of the different labor populations that were brought in under both forced and voluntary conditions from all across the Atlantic, all around the world, even from the Pacific via the Panama Canal. Ultimately, I had to create some sort of focus around this. So the book deals with the 7 countries in the English-speaking or Anglophone Caribbean where there are potters today who are working with heritage traditions. They are working with processes that were inherited from ancestors whose countries of origin spread all across the world. As Frank said, this all started completely unexpectedly and totally casually with a vacation in St. Lucia. My father retired in 1993, and he brought my whole family to St. Lucia, a place they had seen from a cruise ship. And I didn't know, I'd never been to the Caribbean, and encountering that landscape was astonishing. I was living in Massachusetts at the time, and while we were in St. Lucia, the superstorm of 1993 was rolling up and down the coast, and we were watching it on the television. So we're sitting in the tropical paradise. I had no information to help me understand that place. So I got in a van, and I went to the Central Marketplace in Castries, and I looked at the traditional pottery there. And I bought this little kettle, this little pot, and I brought it home, and I thought, all right, I was still living in Massachusetts at the time, I will go to the UMass Library, and I'll read about this. But there wasn't anything to read, or almost nothing. And that's where it started. So I kept going to St. Lucia, and I met some wonderful potters, particularly Kathy Osmond and Irina Alphonse, who I'll talk about a lot. And they said if I came back, they would tell me what they do and how they do it. And that's really how it started. But where it went from there took me literally around the world. In order to understand the history of this pot, I needed to understand the history of the world, particularly the colonial history of the world, where European powers, beginning with that extraordinary moment of Christopher Columbus bumping into a continent he didn't know was there, initiated a period of intense globalization. We think we own globalization, right? This has all just happened in the last, 20 years. No, it started with Columbus. And this incredible mix of influences, of people, of plants, of foods, of cultures that ended up creating this very complicated mix in the Caribbean. And these are the 7 countries where I have focused my energies. But more than anything, this has been about people. Oftentimes when you read archaeology or anthropology, the focus is on the object, but sometimes we forget that people make pots, and you can't separate the potter from the pot. So in writing the book, I followed that sequence of first talking about people, and then about pots, then about process, which is something that potters really have to contribute to this literature, and about how the history wraps all of this into a single package. So this is Kathy Osmond and Irina Alphonse, 2 heritage potters in southern St. Lucia in Choiseul. In 1998, they came with me to the Ensica in Fort Worth. And it was a little different then. I did an hour talk. They did a 2.5-hour demonstration. And the couple of hundred people in the room were as fascinated to watch them work as I continue to be. I was in St. Lucia last week launching the book there, and I have never lost my fascination for watching them make pots. And they have been very close collaborators. This hasn't just been about me writing about them. It's about them sharing their stories with me, helping me to understand who they are and what they do, and then working on projects together. In the end, I had to write the book that I couldn't find. I couldn't find a book about their pots, about them, about their history, so I wrote the darn thing. And the last 7 years of my life have been absurdly focused on that particular effort. All right, so we'll start in St. Lucia, and particularly with the Afro-Caribbean tradition, which we'll find on several different islands. The Afro-Caribbean tradition has been defined as women makers, hand building, local clays, and open firing, and of course the making of functional pots for the domestic environment. In southern St. Lucia, there's a map there you can sort of see. That's the province of Choiseul. It's about 10 square miles. All the potters are there because the clay is there. There was a huge volcanic mud flow about 20,000 years ago that created this sort of fairly lightly decomposed clay that has very unusual properties. Because it's volcanic, it's full of montmorillonite, a very small particle plasticizer, and incredibly coarse at the same time. So it's very plastic, very coarse clay that is absolutely perfect for making pots that have high exposure to thermal shock. But the history of the region is very much defined by its colonial past. In the 18th century, Choiseul was mostly small cocoa and coffee estates with French owners. And then in the 19th century, England took control of the island, and it really became formally a part of the English-speaking Caribbean, except the people speak a French Creole. This is the complexity of the Caribbean. You have layers upon layers upon layers. People of African and Amerindian descent who speak a French Creole in an English-governed colony. But it was after emancipation that I think is the most interesting time, because this was the point with the end of slavery in the English Caribbean in 1838, where the workers now moved off the plantations and went to establish their own communities and, in fact, their own countries. And this period has had very little documentation, but this was the making of the Caribbean, was the post-emancipation period. And where Kathy and Irene are from is a small community called Monsion. And Monsion is a French derivative of Mount Zion. And across the Caribbean, you find many post-emancipation communities called Mount Zion because it is this allusion to the promised land, to the building of a free community for themselves and their families. Alrighty, where are we going now? In St. Lucia, it's very much a women's tradition. You have the transfer of knowledge from mothers to daughters. Meredith Felix there on the left. She had 12 children, 6 boys, 6 girls, and told me her stories of making pots in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Her daughter, Irene Alphonse, is one of my very close friends. Life was very hard. This was a rural tradition, but this was a way for women to earn money in a place where there were very, very few jobs. On the right is Mary Clifford. She is in Delsay, another area of Choiseul. And her mother, Mary, also taught her, continues to work with her, even though she's in her 80s. But Mary Clifford's daughter, Merlene, now has an associate's degree in business and is working towards her 4-year degree and is now, this summer, setting up a special shop to sell her mother's pots to the tourists at the new hotels that have been established in Choiseul. So in a single generation, there has been an astonishing change from a rural agricultural community to a tourist-focused community and trying to figure out where the pots fit into this picture. So I'm going to roam around the Caribbean a little bit, more of these related Afro-Caribbean traditions. In Nevis, a similar picture, Almina Cornelius. She worked with her grandmother and her aunt. That's her grandmother, Marianne Jeffers, because her parents had to leave Nevis to go find employment on other islands. And this is a very common theme of around the Caribbean that alters families and communities. So she worked with her people and her family, and there was a whole community of potters right there in northern Nevis. And they would take their pots by boat across the 2-mile channel to St. Kitts and sell them on the beach. This is a beautiful painting by a Canadian painter of the potters from Nevis selling their pots on the beach in St. Kitts. In Antigua, again, similar situation, a post-emancipation village, Seaview Farm in the center of the country, and Hyacinth Hill House, very well recognized potter there who learned from her mother, Elvie Stephen, who also made pots. So we still have record of this generational transfer right now. Whether that's going to continue is another question. Finding any documentation of this has always been a fascinating effort. I saw a black and white Xerox of this image from a 1941 National Geographic in the archives in the museum in Antigua, and was able to track it backwards and find the magazine itself and buy copies of it and distribute to various people. And so very, very little documentation, but often looking to more popular resources was a way for me to track this tradition. In Jamaica, you still have one woman left from a population of hundreds of women 50 years ago, who in Spanish Town, that's Merlene Roden, her, again, very famous mother, Ma Lu, she is still making pots in the Afro-Caribbean tradition, but she's the last one. And none of her daughters are interested, so it's probably going to end there. But in Trenchtown, just 12 miles away, right smack in the middle of Lower Kingston, there's a whole group of potters who are making pots a very different way, also in an African tradition. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And they have focused very much on gardenware. Out of this dual tradition came a man named Cecil Baugh, Jamaican potter, only other potter I've been able to find in English-speaking Caribbean who had a book written about him with wonderful historian and linguist in Jamaica named Laura Tana. So coming out of those traditions, he worked with Edna Manley with the founding of the Jamaica School of Art that now is the Edna Manley College of Visual and Performing Arts, and is the only place in the Caribbean where you can actually get a 4-year degree in ceramics. And it was because of him and the traditions he came out of and translating that into a contemporary educational system. And there's a whole lot more to say about these folks, so I encourage you to check out the book. In Barbados, we start to look at different influences, not just from West and Central Africa, but now from Europe. And the practices of English country potters were transferred directly to Barbados through white indentured potters that were brought in the 17th century to work on the plantations to make sugarwares, the clay pots that were used to process sugar. And they have a very signature object there, the monkey jar. This is a water cooling jar, right? And I was delighted to find this particular image on the left. It's a watercolor from a journal of a sea captain, an English sea captain who was in Barbados in 1808 and documented these women with their monkey jar sitting down in the marketplace. There you have some really extraordinary documentation in the 1960s. Dr. Jerome Handler, a very famous Caribbean historian, and he did his PhD on these potters and took a whole lot of pictures and was kind enough to let me use them in the book, where he documents these processes that are a direct transfer of English country pottery traditions, both the unglazed monkey jars and also lead glazed pots. So on the right you see who's that? Clyde Murray, rubbing molasses on an unfired pot so that gentleman right there, Isef's father, I can't remember his name right now, can dust raw lead powder onto it. And then they were fired once in these homemade stone and clay kilns. In Trinidad, again, no question where the tradition came from. East Indian workers were brought in under an indenture scheme that began after the emancipation of the slaves, when the slaves chose not to work on the plantations. Thank you very much. The English landholders, sugar plantation owners in Trinidad and in Guyana brought in indentured labor from India. And so one thing most people don't know is about half the population of Trinidad and Guyana are of East Indian origin. And there you have a very direct transfer of the wheel throwing, kiln firing technologies of India, and also pottery made for Hindu ritual festivals. Diwali, which is across the Indo-European, Caribbean, Indian world. Amazing thing. If you ever get a chance to go to Diwali, go. It's all hovers around these tiny little clay oil lamps called diyas, and lighting of millions of these in order to honor Lakshmi and work towards prosperity in the new year. And finally, in Guyana, I went looking for what remains of any continuous Amerindian traditions, of indigenous traditions. There was a great deal of disruption along the coast with the importation of all sorts of things and people, Europeans and Africans and Indians, and along the coast, the Arawak Indian population there was pretty much pushed out. But in the interior, Guyana is a big wild country, and in the interior there are still some potters who are struggling to work with traditional practice and to find new markets. But along the coast, there has also been a revival of the decorated pottery of the Arawak Indians, and it has become a really powerful force for contemporary studio potters in Guyana. Alrighty, so let's talk a little bit about the pots themselves. These are pots that were made to work. They were made to work in urban and colonial environments. They were generally copies of European pottery forms, but made in the local clays without glaze and used in the kitchen and the garden for storing food, for cooking food, for washing things, for storing water, for cooling water. So there's a whole catalog of these particular forms, and these same forms were made in all 7 of the countries, using different methods, but the same pots made throughout the English-speaking Caribbean. A market for these traditional functional forms is, of course, limited. People don't live that way anymore, but there are still those who choose to keep buying and using the pots, particularly Rastafarian chefs feel that working very close to the earth and using these beautiful traditional pots is important for serving their food. Gardenware. Starting about 50 years ago, there's really been a transition to the making of flower pots and gardenware that is fueling very large numbers of pots and potters in Jamaica and in Trinidad. So gardenware has become a replacement for the earlier functional domestic forms. And I want to talk a little bit about the most iconic form in the Caribbean. This is the coal pot and the cooking pot. It's a charcoal brazier and a round bottom cooking pot. And in the French-speaking Caribbean, that cooking pot is called a canouille or a cannerie. And it's a round bottom cooking pot like you see all over the world. But I was trying to figure out where the name came from. It was not a French name. The proverb, vieille canouille café bon bouillon, is old pots make good soup. It's from a French proverb that has similar layers of meaning that allude to significant pleasure with known relationships, shall we say. But it wasn't a French word, okay? And they weren't able to prove it was an Amerindian word. So in poking around, I found this reference in a 17th century documentation about calling carob pots for making cassava beer, calling them cannerie in imitation of the Spanish. So then it was like, okay, where did the Spanish get the word? And this map is a map of Columbus's voyages, all of which go first to the Canary Islands and then to the Caribbean, as with most other European journeys. So it is quite possible that this was a transactional word, that the word cannerie came from the Canary Islands, and referred to, I need 3 canneries of those, please give me those, when you don't, if you're ordering your cassava beer, right, and you don't know the name of anything in someone's language. So, and this would not be unusual. We still certainly call white, fancy, decorated tableware china. So this idea of applying place to pot as a transactional word is not unknown. The coal pot itself, the cooking brazier, has a really interesting history. You can buy miniatures of these all over the Caribbean in clay and metal, and the earlier version I bought this one in Curacao, cast iron versions could have been used as boat stoves, all sorts of things. You can also see braziers, cooking braziers like this in West and Central Africa and in North Africa. So there was an idea that these were African pots that were the shape was cast into iron and then made back into clay in St. Lucia. But I didn't think that was all of it. So I started looking at paintings, genre paintings from Europe. And so you can see in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century evidence of the use of clay braziers and cooking pots in Europe, but in working class Europe. So again, we don't often document the things that poor people do. So it becomes a little bit more difficult to dig to the heart of this. So certainly coal pots like this, like the ones used in St. Lucia, were being made and used in Europe. But it just got more interesting. I saw this picture on Wikipedia, and then I had to go backwards and get to the museum in Greece and everything else. This is a cooking pot and a charcoal brazier from Greece, from 450 BC. So this is a very long tradition in Europe and the Mediterranean that was translated to the Caribbean for cooking pots. But I want to get to process. I'm really trying hard to, oh boy, time is flying. Process is where is where the potters really have a lot to say. And this is where we can make a real contribution by observing process and by tracking heritage. The pottery in St. Lucia was thought to be Carib Indian, but once I watched potters working in West Africa, and then finally, a few years ago, tracked down some Carib potters in Suriname, it was clear that there were entirely different methods at work here. So I'm going to go ahead and let that play. In looking at documentation of Bafia women potters, the description of their process in Cameroon, I believe that the way potters make pots in St. Lucia, and this is Irene making a very large flower pot, that way of making, that way of manipulating the clay is very specific, the way of pounding the clay, of building the clay on the lap. And I believe, once upon a time, during the colonial period, a Bafia woman from Cameroon was enslaved, was brought to St. Lucia, moved off the plantation, and taught a whole bunch of people how to make pots exactly this way, because they all make the pots exactly this way. In those walk-around potters in Jamaica, there's no question that documentation, Frank actually provided that slide over there. He saw Lottie Qualley demonstrate in this country. And the potters, the male potters in Trenchtown, they walk around the pots. They don't turn the pots, they turn themselves. And that is very much a Nigerian way of making. I spoke a little bit earlier about Barbados and the translation of the technologies, even down to the tools. This two-person wheel, it's a way of throwing where one person is doing this all day while the potter actually throws on the wheel head. The throwing off the hump, the using of the ribs, the movement of the hands, very definite English country pottery. And then in Trinidad, the use of wheels to make these astonishing numbers of dias. And this is production pottery at its most astonishing. 2 seconds per dia. They make 5,000 a day. When I was there for Diwali, in one pottery, there was a showroom, there was a hallway with 100,000 dias in it that by the end of the week were all gone. Okay, this is unbelievable throwing, and I think he made that wheel out of washing machine parts. So there is this whole history of the world in the hands of the potters. So what is happening now, right? What do we do with this tradition? One of the biggest questions in '98 from the audience watching Irene and Kathy was, what's going to happen now? And they said, well, the young women don't want to make it anymore. It's like, okay, that's, from my position, that's their choice. They can do that, right? And it is a very fragile enterprise. Kathy died 3 years ago after a short, nasty bout of cancer. And her whole generation of makers, as well as poets and performers, et cetera, that really built the culture of contemporary St. Lucia is passing. A single instance, there was a horrible mudslide in St. Lucia, Hurricane Tomas in 2010. And this man, Sabinus Thomas, he could sell anything to anyone. And he marketed huge numbers of heritage objects, crafts, pots, et cetera. And since he and his whole family and his whole shop was buried in a landslide, sales have gone way down in St. Lucia. So in that environment, the contributions of a single person can be incredibly important. Hello, I'm not flipping, thank you. Unfortunately, St. Lucia does not have a museum, unlike the other 6 countries in the book, but they're working on it. But that didn't stop Teresa Pascal. She came from St. Lucia, spent 30 years in France working at museums, came home, built her house in Choiseul, and made her own museum. And she has an astonishing collection of domestic tools and implements and pots. Potters in heritage traditions are not frozen in time. They are not stuck. They will change. They enjoy new information. I've been working with them for 15 years, building these small kilns that make their production easier, stronger. When I was there last week, Jane Fauché, Irene's sister, said, I love having this kiln because as I get older, it makes it so much easier for me to fire the pots. So she can work longer having a kiln. I brought a group of students down. We adapted the technology with information from Trinidadian kilns. And Alicia and Mary Pamphil right there, they've altered their kiln. They made it bigger. She extended her firing schedule. So they do change. And hotels, as buyers of traditional pottery, have found ways to incorporate these pots into very contemporary design schemes. So I want to close with the importance of potters writing books. It takes you out of your studio. It dooms you to years of insecurity and staring at computers, and it is like the craziest form of torture I've ever been through, but please do it. It is very important. Our voices are very important because we understand these potters from the clay up, whereas anthropologists, archaeologists are really looking at it from the outside. So our voices contributing to this dialogue is really critical, and there have been an amazing number of books written by potters and ceramic art historians who are adding to this story. So I just need to finish up with gratitude. It has been an amazing 25 years that I backed into sideways with my eyes closed, never saw it coming. Last week I was in St. Lucia and launched the book there, and I've made a commitment to giving a copy of the book to all of these collaborators in all of these places. And I went down there with 18 books in suitcases, and but the Potters were really powerfully moved. And Lucina and others, the woman with the book on the top, she said, "I will have this for my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren." So you don't know what kind of contribution you're going to make. You don't know what kind of friends you're going to have when you move off the beaten path. And ultimately, it makes me think a lot about value and what we value. And in this case, the value here doesn't depend on the price of the pot, but on the power of this story and the capacity of the pot to really reveal these hidden histories of the world.